Hello everyone and welcome to our webinar today in partnership with NMI. My name is Neil Perry and I'm Managing Editor for FinTech Magazine. So today's session is called Navigating the Regulatory Environment, How Payment Providers Can Prepare for Increased Liability in the Industry. So awful lot to get through today. So let's just dig into that question a little bit first, if we may. We're looking into how the regulations in Washington, DC can affect the businesses of ISOs, merchants and other industry-leading payments providers. That includes examining the latest fraud detection opportunities and product developments and learning about the critical importance of fraud prevention across the whole industry too. We're looking at a few case studies, learning from them as best we can, and the best practice for the future too. So a tremendous amount for us to get through over the next 35, 40 minutes, and I certainly can't do that alone. So it's a great pleasure to introduce Scott Talbott, Senior Vice President of Government Affairs at the Electronic Transactions Association, or ETA to its friends, in Washington, DC. He's responsible for its governmental strategies and directing ETA's all of policy and advocacy efforts. And also joining us today is Darryl Cumming, Director of Product Management at NMI. Hello to both of you. Now, one thing that is so important today, as well as to you two gentlemen, is you, our audience today. If you're joining us live, your involvement today is absolutely critical. We want your thoughts, we want your questions, so do pop them in the chat function, which should be over there somewhere, and we'll get through as many of those as we can in the Q&A as we go through the session, and do round those up at the end as well. And if I have one request today, that is to keep those questions as short and sweet as you possibly can. That'd be much appreciated and mean we get to the heart of the issues you want to get to. It's amazing how some people do send essays in sometimes, which take rather a long time to read out. So keep them short and sweet and we'll get through as many as we possibly can. So, to business. The logical place to start is looking at the problems, I suppose, and that make the regulatory environment such a challenge to navigate, and why we have these expert gentlemen with us today. So let's cut to the chase. This is one for both of you. Do you think that most payment providers are genuinely prepared for the increased liability that's coming into the industry now?
Sure, I'm happy to start. Neil, thank you for having me. Darryl, nice to see you, and thanks to NMI. I think your question, Neil, is a big one and with so few words. So let's try and unpack it for everybody. I think in short, the answer is yes, but I want to break my answer as a lawyer that I am into two parts. The first is that on an everyday basis, payments companies are prepared to deal with the risks of regulatory overhang, the risk of increased liability from the regulators. What we're talking about here is the regulators are really focusing on, the federal regulators in DC are really focusing on the payments industry. And that has taken the potential for liability, as you've laid out, Neil, up. So created regulatory headwinds, so created a regulatory overhang, or I like to say a regulatory hangover. And so the companies have been working on these issues for a long time and are, I think, largely prepared. A lot of what we're talking about is just the daily blocking and tackling and underwriting and risk management of merchants, of payments processors, something payments companies do very, very well. We'll go into some of the details later on when we talk about what this increased scrutiny from federal regulators looks like, what are they looking at, how to defend yourself. But the second part of my answer is that companies are adjusting to dealing with this new overhang, lots of different ways, learning from some of the case laws, some of the settlements, some of the consent orders, some of the fines and penalties. So it's an ever-evolving landscape. And in short, though, I think, Neil, they are ready and they are continuing to get ready or be more ready to handle this increased oversight.
Thanks so much for that, Scott. I'm going to agree with you in some regards. I'm going to disagree in a few regards. I would say some payments companies are fully prepared, that they're on top of these regulations. They're doing their enhanced due diligence. They're staying on top of this. It's often at times very manual work, and they're making those investments to make sure that they're on top of this and they're leading the industry and protecting their business. There is a lot of up and comers in the industry, though. We're seeing more and more software companies transitioning into providing card processing services. And a lot of these companies are very new to underwriting. They're new to ongoing risk review. And while They might feel that they're in a position where they're secure. I feel like there is a trend where a lot of these novices do not have the expertise. They don't have reliable veteran staff on hand, and they're struggling with some of these new regulations and risks that they're seeing. But I do agree that, in a general consensus, some of the larger companies out there are prepared and are ready to go with this. And I'll hand back to you, Neil.
So I know one thing we'll be talking a lot about over the next half an is the evolution of the industry. If you feel you're on top of things, then maybe you should be double checking, because things have changed since you probably thought you were on top of things. But let's look at the here and now. Why is it so important that we talk about this subject now for you?
If you want, I'll jump in on this one first, Scott. I don't think there's any better time to be talking about this than the here and now. For example, just a few days ago, the FTC published a tweet indicating that their latest data shows that consumer reported losses are up to $8.8 billion lost to scams in 2022. That's a 30% increase from what we saw in 2021. Go back a year further, and FTC was reporting a 70% increase from 2020 to 2021. Now, these are only consumer reported numbers. So think of how much more is out there that's not being reported to these authorities. So I think it's imperative that we're talking about this. And I also think the ETA is very much a guiding star for everyone in the industry to be staying on top of these trends. There's a whole lot going on out there. The ETA is an incredible resource to be finding out, staying on top of that, and making sure that you're protecting your business. Scott, would love to hear what you have to share.
Yeah, so I have to agree that this is a topic that is always pertinent, is always timely, because fraudsters never sleep. So as we build a 10-foot wall, they build an 11-foot ladder, and we need to build that 12-foot wall. And guess what? There's a 13-foot ladder coming right behind it. So this is something that we can never rest on. Devoting lots and lots of resources, countless resources to fighting fraud, which also helps keep the regulators at bay. Just as we work on developing new products and services to keep things moving forward in the payment space, P2P, contactless, mobile wallets, et cetera, we also spend the same amount of time fighting fraud. This issue will be timely next year, the year after that, and the year after that. So we can never rest, because the fraudsters never rest. And so we are charged with protecting the payments industry, the payment system, and making sure people, consumers around the globe have confidence in the payments industry. And we do that by fighting fraud. So it will always be, unfortunately, a timely topic.
Now, most people will know some or most about the changes to liability, the increased liability. But let's just try and iron out some of those grey areas, those kinks in people's knowledge. Could you, between you, sort of spell out what those changes are? Because I guess the most important thing is that people are honest with themselves and humble enough to know that they can always be learning.
Yeah. So what we're seeing, just real quickly, is, as I said, the regulators have turned their attention, the federal regulators in DC have turned their attention to the payments industry. And in the past, if a merchant committed fraud, the payments industry could say, well, look, we did what we could, and they still were out there stealing and committing fraud and cheating people. And it's not that's not our problem. It certainly is part of our problem, but it's not our fault. The federal regulators have, over the last couple of years, taken the tack that they're going after the payments industry, saying, you know what, we actually disagree. We think you had a role to play here. And they sort of on their own shifted the liability standard, shifted the legal standard to one of having actual knowledge of the crime or the fraud that was being committed, to a new standard. And this is what's causing some challenges, in that the payments company knew or should have known. The regulator's argument is that the payments companies should have seen the red flags, we'll talk about those in a minute, and thus triggered a knowledge in their mind they should have done something. Okay, with that being said, the changes that we're seeing, the risks to liability to the payments companies are financial. There is a new focus, and we'll talk about it's changed slightly, it's in flux, focus on collecting fines from the payments companies, and not just the amount of money they earned, but the total amount of the fraud that was committed. We're seeing a loss of reserves when a payment processor onboards a merchant. They collect reserves in advance. The federal regulators are grabbing those, seizing those, and saying those are assets of ours to make consumers whole. They don't belong to you. So now a payment processor is faced with losing revenue and losing their insurance policy in the form of the reserves. We're seeing a lot of consent orders that say you are no longer able to serve these particular classes of merchants or groups of merchants, so cutting off their ability to do what they do best, that is serve merchants. We also see the regulators installing monitoring systems or people to come on site and conduct audits to make sure that the payments company is in compliance with the changes as a part of the consent order. And then finally, reputational risk. Being accused of committing fraud has risk-averse general counsels running for cover. And that has broader implications than just any financial fine. The reputational risk, the legal risk, the headline risk. So all of those are on the table. These are the tools, the threats, the sticks that the regulators are using to try and force, encourage, coerce payments companies to take a harder look under their theory of what they do or what they should have.
Scott, I think I'll just expand on a great point you made, the comments around should have known, should have seen, and how that concept is changing in the payment space in the eyes of regulators. As I was researching for this webinar, one of the things I noticed with a lot of these FTC actions is that there is an increasing number of merchants, businesses, or owners who were found or who were the subject of actions a number of years ago. In the following years, the FTC is starting to follow back up with their payment processors. And I saw at least 3 or 4 examples of this in the last 12 months, where you might think you're clean, this merchant, we might do business with them, and they had an action against them. Maybe now we're safe. But again, that's not the end of the cycle. The FTC is continuing to do that analysis. They're digging into who was processing.
No, you're right. Exactly, Darryl. We'll talk about red flags, I'm sure, later in the program. But one of them is, are the merchant you're working with, have they ever been fined before? Have they ever been subject to a regulatory or an enforcement action? And if so, that is one of the tiles in the mosaic that paints a picture of what this merchant is going to do or may likely to do, and thus triggering a higher level of diligence or due diligence from the payment processor.
Very good.
So it's a good point.
Okay, we do have our first questions coming in. One there from Christopher, which I'll get onto in just a moment. So do keep those coming in the Q&A function just over to the side of the screen. But let's move on to vulnerabilities. Where between the two of you do you think payment providers are most vulnerable at the moment?
I can jump in if you want. I think one area that I see a lot of payment providers are in a vulnerable situation is in regards to the automation of ongoing risk protection. It's a critical vulnerability. For merchant businesses and owners within your portfolio, being able to automate as much of the ongoing risk review as possible is essential. It's very time-consuming and manual work. Another major vulnerability is just a lack of audit capabilities, making sure you're able to prove that you're doing this enhanced due diligence, you're keeping track of the merchants and their ownership structures within your portfolio. Having that documented and having it to back up on for regulators is a critical piece of the puzzle. The last thing I'll add in is that it really boils down to a numbers game. As Scott mentioned earlier, fraudsters are always looking for new ways to stay ahead. You build a 10-foot wall, they'll build the 11-foot ladder. I think it's fair to say most payment providers are doing what they can to protect themselves and reduce these vulnerabilities, but there are still major gaps since historically it's such a labor-intensive and manual space, and we'll expand on some potential solutions for that later. Scott, I would love to hear what you have to add.
Yeah, so Darryl, I think I would add to your list, probably the greatest risk is a merchant who is hell-bent on committing fraud. And they, just as they are thieves themselves, or these types of merchants. And so someone who knows the system, knows how to play the game, if you will, or knows how it all works. If they are hell-bent on fraud, they're going to work hard to achieve that fraud. Query why they didn't just work that hard at selling legitimate goods and services, but that's another issue for another time. So a merchant who I think is a great risk is a merchant who comes in, presents well, shows himself as a legitimate merchant, and then morphs like a chameleon into the fraudster. Those, I think, are, and we have systems to try and deal with this, but those are the ones that require the most effort and are the most dangerous, because they have earned trust and a reputation, and then they pivot and turn into a fraudster. And that, I think, is a challenge to deal with in our own personal lives. Dealing with anyone who is one face and then another always creates a challenge. So multiply that for the business side. So I think, Neil, that's where I see the greatest risk.
Because that's obviously a harder risk to foresee. If you've welcomed someone into your ecosystem, if you like, and you think they're one thing, that's a very difficult thing to defend against, I would imagine.
Yeah, in essence, it requires, as all merchants do, continuous monitoring after the fact, after they've been onboarded. There's a series of steps we'll talk about, I'm sure, to monitor them. But it's an active step, but it has to take place. Site visits, et cetera, et cetera. Again, we'll talk about it coming up, but it is difficult to catch somebody who has changed into something that you were not expecting.
Okay, let's just jump to the Q&As that have been coming in so far. You can hear my dog wanting to join in as well. I'm not sure what his fraud knowledge is like, but I doubt it's great. This one is from Christopher. He says, Scott, how do you foresee PCI becoming simpler for SMBs as PCI overlaps with fraud in many degrees?
Yeah, I would push back on the premise of the question that it will become simpler. Not because out of lack of desire or willingness, it's simply the reality of our payment system is very complex, and it's getting more complex, and thieves track that and match that. So think crypto. Crypto is on the scene. Most people don't understand it or are learning it. Thieves have already figured out ways to steal money using crypto. And so we have to stay ahead of it. And so PCI, as an industry standard setting body, they must do as well. So there are efforts to try and make things simpler. CFPB would like to make things simpler, but the reality of our marketplace and the reality of the threats we face simply will not lend itself to that. And so we need to rise to meet that.
I think just on that trend as well, I know the question was for Scott, but I will add in that just data privacy and security in general is another area that you might be starting to get into trouble with regulators if you are not ensuring that that data is encrypted as it needs to be. It's one thing here to sit and talk about fraud and all this, but if you're not protecting primary cardholder data as you should be in the first place, then there's a bigger problem at play there.
Okay, well, we have been talking about fraud a lot, so let's look into that a bit further, because that really is key to this whole conversation. I'm going to use a strong word here, but you know what? I'm the host. I can. How rampant do you feel it is at the moment? How prevalent? How? Well, I keep picking words, but do people really appreciate how big an issue it is?
I mean, I think fraudsters are running rampant, but I do think a lot of companies have controls in place to help mitigate this risk and to stay ahead of it. I do think it is a massive issue. And I was really surprised, again, doing my research for this, looking at the total diversity of different FTC actions across different verticals. If you think a specific industry that you're working in is safe and just you take that for granted, I think you're in trouble. Just looking at FTC findings, things ranging from made in USA false advertising claims through to payments companies opening entirely fictitious merchant processing accounts, or obvious recent cases in health tech and companies selling consumer data to different social media sites. I mean, it is all over the spectrum. So I don't think it can be appreciated like how massive this issue really is. It's probably wider than we all realize, unless you live in the weeds every day like Scott probably is.
I would agree that, I mean, if we define fraud to include credit card fraud and mail order bride fraud and other scams, we all get the emails and the telemarketing calls. I think, Darryl, just to add to your quotes, the FTC reported that consumers lost over $6 billion with a B in fraud during 2021, which was a 70% increase. And now we're in 2023. That number is going to keep going up. There's lots of types of fraud built into that definition, not just credit card fraud, but being tricked out of money in general. And so the fraudsters are everywhere. They will never stop. They will never sleep. Again, why don't they get real jobs? They would crush it, but that's a different story. But it's fraudsters are everywhere. And we do our part to help keep credit card fraud and other types of fraud off of the system. We also work to educate consumers with public service announcements, with different types of education, different tools and other things like two-factor authentication, biometrics, geolocation tracking. all of those tools help to keep that fraud from landing in a consumer's lap. Because as you all know, one of the important hallmarks of the credit card and debit card industry is that consumers have zero liability for fraud committed by third parties. And that's huge. Even though the US law allows us to assess them $50 per occurrence, we have chosen not to do that. And so we not only have a reputational drive to keep fraud out, we have a pecuniary interest in keeping fraud out. And we do it because it's the right thing to do. But it is, Neil, to answer your question, everywhere.
Well, let's just return to our Q&A here. We have one here from Robert Sullivan, and this is a good juxtaposition between US law and UK law. If I just bring the question up because it's just moved. This was from Robert. He says, UK regulators are proposing on mandating payment providers to reimburse scam victims funded 50-50 between sending and receiving PSP. Could similar proposals emerge in the US?
So the question here under US law is governed by Regulation E. And the magic language of Regulation E, which governs fraud during electronic transactions, says that a bank must make a consumer whole for unauthorized transactions. And the debate in the US is around what is an unauthorized transaction. Clearly, if the Nigerian prince gets a hold of your credit card or encourages you to send money, that is an unauthorized transaction. But what happens if I mean to send money to Darryl, but I actually send it to Neil? I have a fat finger is the type of error. Or what happens if someone calls up and says, oh, please send me money. My car broke down, or whatever the fact pattern is, or I'm from your bank, please send me money. And you send the money, the consumer sends the money anyway. Are those last two examples unauthorized or not? And so a large part of the industry is taking the position that those transactions, while unfortunate, ill-advised, and terrible, are technically authorized because the consumer hit send. Yes, they meant to send it to 6 instead of 7. They didn't mean, they were tricked. So we've seen proposals in the U.S. Congress. We've seen discussion by federal regulators to try and change that liability standard. But then if they did that, it would create new problems. One, the dollar amount of fraud would go up. And two, the fraudsters would know that the consumers weren't on the hook. So consumers would be less worried, less concerned, less vigilant, goes the theory, to fighting fraud and looking for fraud, knowing that they weren't on the hook whatsoever. And then you could have people who, gosh, it may be hard to believe, but abuse the system and be in cahoots to trigger fraud. So Darryl and I might conspire with each other to send money to a third party that we both knew, and then claim it as fraudulent. And so it's not an easy solution. It creates a lot of problems down the line, but it is something that the industry is working hard to remedy and avoid. Tons of educational efforts. A number of P2P platforms say, please enter the cell phone number of the recipient. Lots of checks and balances going on the front end to help prevent this type of fraud, period. But I think the short answer to the question is difficult to see a regulation change in the U.S. And one last point, the Federal Reserve is rolling out a real-time gross settlement system called FedNow. They plan to do that early this year. Canada is working on its rail as well. But FedNow would be subject to Regulation E. And any change in the liability standard as we currently enjoy, and I think it's been there since 1972, any change in that liability standard could weaken the outlook for FedNow. Small banks who might be willing to participate in FedNow, if they were asked to shoulder the burden of fraud, different types of fraud, or if we change the definition, they may not be willing to participate in FedNow because the cost might be prohibitive for them. So it's a simple question, but the answer is unfortunately very complex.
I will move us on quite quickly because we've been talking a lot about the problems and the challenges. A couple more I want to tick off on there before we start getting on to more of the practical solutions and advice that people can take away from today. The financial elephant in the room, if you wish to call it that, would be crypto. We've mentioned it a couple of times, but not really looked at that specifically. The market is constantly changing. Crypto is the big disruptor in a lot of this. What particular challenges do you both feel that's presenting?
I mean, I think confidence is at an all-time low right now on the crypto front. Everybody's seen what's happened and come up in the news in the last 6 months or so. We've got all these companies just completely evaporating, it seems, and going bankrupt. It's a pretty scary space. I consider it the Wild West right now. So it is definitely not an industry that you want to be engaging in from a payment services perspective, unless you really think you have a robust risk analysis and ongoing monitoring solution in place. I wouldn't even think about dipping my toe in it based on the current trajectories. Scott, I'd love to hear.
Yeah, no, Joe, I appreciate that. I would add that we don't have a regulatory framework for crypto in place, right? There's still, the products are new, and the regulators and lawmakers are struggling here in London, Canada, to try to put a framework around it. Our suggestion is to use the laws that exist now, the Bank Secrecy Act, KYC, AML, et cetera, and apply them. But they don't quite apply yet. And combine that with what Darryl just said, that most people, and I said earlier, most people don't understand crypto. And so you've got two strikes, no framework or not a solid framework yet, and people don't understand it. And fraudsters are running rampant for sure in the crypto space. That's an area they are exploiting. And so I think it's an area that sort of brings all of these things together with current trends, the ability you need to know what you're doing. Educating consumers is difficult to do here, but it is still very much in the air at this point.
Yeah, I guess I'll come back with one other thing, Neil, before we move on, is just I think a lot of people in the crypto space, it might be acceptable to be accepting payments via crypto. If you're a payments company or you have a web store and you want to accept it, it might be an area to live into. But again, it's on the exchange front that I'm trying to definitely warn caution here. And Scott, what are your thoughts just on accepting payments in crypto in general? I saw you shaking your head.
Yeah, thanks, sir. I know we're not there yet because our industry will not move without the regulatory framework in place. So a company that says they're accepting crypto is taking your cryptocurrency, immediately converting it to fiat and running the transaction through under fiat. And then they may convert back to crypto to give you back your crypto. But nobody is actually processing a transaction in crypto yet. Right. It's not legally allowed for the traditional space. I think stable coins could serve to cross the Rubicon between the investment use case and payments. One other reason why we're not processing in crypto is the volatility risk. Sure. The time it takes from authorization, clearing, and settlement, that price could move either way, and we are not in the speculative business. But one of the solutions is stable coins, solves the price fluctuation issue, provides a stable value, will be regulated, and could be used to process transactions in going forward, but we're not there yet. And
that's very helpful.
Probably not until next year before we see a regulatory structure in place.
Thanks for those insights, Scott.
Yeah, now, Scott, you've actually set me up very nicely for the next section I want to move on to, because we've talked an awful lot about problems, we've talked an awful lot about challenges and fraudsters and their enormous ladders, increasingly enormous ladders, it seems. But I want to look into solutions and look at ways people can navigate their way through the regulatory changes and the increased liability. So let's look at some ways our audience can tack their way through all of those problems, and do keep the questions coming in as well. For you, what are the historic cases that really stand out, leap out at you in this field that everyone needs to know about? And more importantly, what can everyone learn from them?
Sure. Yeah, you want to take it? I'm happy to take it.
You can go first if you want.
All right.
Thanks.
So I think we have the image I like is the or the metaphor I like is tiles in the mosaic or trees in the forest. You have to look at all these cases and try to string them all together. And so we could go into chapter and verse of each one, but let me summarize the cases for everybody. So the lessons learned. So some smart legal thinkers have already done this. I know the smart people at NMI have done this. A couple of things. One, what the regulators are looking for, and this is sort of the red flags, and these are the lessons learned, is things that are wrong with the application or behavior that doesn't seem to make sense. The easiest one, the one that the regulators usually start with, is do you have a high chargeback ratio? Is it over 1% or for that particular segment of merchants? If you've got a really high chargeback ratio, I'm talking like 20%, the regulators are going to see it as a red flag. Now, any one of these in and of themselves is not dispositive, but when you add them all together and create that mosaic or that forest, this is where the regulators will hone in. high chargeback ratios? Do you have a lot of requests for refunds? Do you have complaints being filed by state, local governments against the merchant? Do you have lawsuits being filed against the merchant? Do you see the merchant engaging in activities, and Darryl mentioned a couple of them? Are they load balancing? Are they delaying chargebacks? Are they spreading sales over multiple accounts in an attempt to hide themselves, to obfuscate the fraud that they're trying to commit? Do they use a lot of shell companies? One we talked about earlier. Do they have a past of settlement actions or enforcement actions with the regulators? Do they use PO boxes as addresses? Do they have sort of a poor internal controls? Are they missing, or they have incomplete or inconsistent info on a regular basis? All of these things, again, anyone could have a rational explanation, but when you put them all together, this is, Neil, what the regulators are looking for. And in terms of lessons learned, don't do those things, or watch out for those things. Don't onboard or continue to keep on board merchants who engage in that type of behavior. Companies need to, and Darryl, I'll kick it over to you in a minute. This is going to be NMI's strength. You need to make sure that the merchant is not doing those things, and if they start to morph, to quickly stop it, to quickly call them, reach out to them, document it, take these steps and more that I know Darryl will talk about. Those are some of the lessons we're seeing, and then I'm happy to go in some of the court cases. But for the most part, that's the easiest way to think about it.
Yeah, that's a great start, Scott. Thank you. Again, I'm not going to go into specific business use cases. There's lots of them if you start scanning the FTC website, but certain trends that I've seen, things like enhancing on what Scott said, the chargebacks, refunds, complaints from local and state governments, obviously. Other things like marketing practices, hidden auto renewals for businesses within your business network, communicating that you have an easy cancellation policy when in fact you perhaps maybe don't have a simple cancellation policy, or make it very tough for someone to cancel your services. Just general customer complaints as well. And boarding of fake merchants is something that I was surprised at how much it was popping up in different FTC actions as I was reviewing them, where you would think somebody at these payment processing companies would see what's going on and be able to alert authorities and regulatory bodies to what's going on. But it appears that a lot of things are sneaking through. And so it's something to keep an eye on as well.
Well, if you I was going to say, Scott, if you understand what these red flags are that the regulators are looking for, do you almost have to think like the regulator, think what they're looking for, think what the red flags are? And if you're doing that, I guess you're ahead of the curve slightly. Is that the best way? Is that the best armory for someone to have a lot of the time?
Now, it's part of it, right? You have to think about it, absolutely, thinking like the regulators, but also thinking like the criminals. Right? What are they going to do? Because they're going to morph. As you squeeze here, they're going to come out here, right? One of my guiding adages is money always finds a way, and thieves will always try and find a way. So as you put more focus on one particular area, thieves will morph into another area. So thinking like the regulators, thinking like the criminals, thinking like the fraudsters, and then acting on it. It's not enough just to go, well, we thought about it. You need to take steps, and NMI can help you do that, as well as other payments companies, your lawyers, processors. Take steps to implement systems, both in the onboarding and the ongoing on the systems to monitor, looking for those risks. So there's lots of things, anticipating your question, companies can do to protect themselves from this. But knowing how the regulators think is certainly a big part of it.
Yeah, I think I'll just expand on that. Obviously, at Agreement Express, an NMI company, our focus is very much on helping to automate as much of these initial early warning indicators as possible. We want to help your risk analysts focus on the items that really require their true expertise and attention after it's been initially flagged. A lot of the initial work, staying on top of your portfolio, it's even called out explicitly in the ETA's own risk underwriting guidelines, which I highly recommend. But it calls out that the enhanced due diligence, there you go, the enhanced due diligence process is manual and labor intensive. I mean, there's no way around that. Our mission and our goal is to help automate the easier parts of that, help your team and your experts focus where their attention is needed. It's, as we've learned throughout this webinar, staying on top of what the regulatory bodies are doing, staying on top of what the fraudsters are doing. I mean, it's a full-time job for numerous people, and a difficult one to stay caught up with. So I highly recommend, in addition to documenting your policy, going through those underwriting guidelines, make sure you have something in place to help you carry that load.
Because how intelligent, sorry, Scott, I was going to just pick up on that, Darryl. How intelligent do those tools have to be now to stay on top and at very least at pace with what's going on in the environment?
It's a great question. And I mean, I see a lot of our newer customers might have once done this with a homegrown solution. And these are payments companies. They're focused on processing payments. They're focused, if they're a software company, on whatever their specific vertical is. Their expertise is not building automated risk underwriting and monitoring solutions. And so to try to build that one, it's a steep hill to climb. But then in addition to that, to keep it up to date, to make sure that it's scalable, you can adjust your risk guidelines as needed, start to tweak your flags that are coming to your team and adjust recommendations. It's more than a full-time job, and you would need a large dev team to keep that going.
Yeah, agreed. The short answer is you have to be very sophisticated. The system is more sophisticated. The criminals are more sophisticated as well. So.
Yeah, Scott, I did interrupt you there. Was there a further point you were wanting to make there?
Just one example of increased sophistication and increased an example of how the fraudsters morph, and that is dark patterns is the new term that we're seeing. Dark patterns are, I think it's a little bit of hyperbole, but okay. The definition of a dark pattern is using tricks and psychological steps to try to get a consumer to do something they wouldn't normally do. Things like hurry up, sales are limited, be the first one to call or you're going to miss out, negative marketing, subscription services, et cetera, et cetera. All of these are sort of new techniques that are being fought, not so much just stealing your money, but tricking you or trying to trick you into taking action that, as we said, you wouldn't normally take. And so this is just the thieves have moved away from some of the simpler types of fraud and into more complex types of fraud. So you need to stay ahead of that.
One question we just had in on the Q&A was about whether recording is going to be available of this. Yes, that should be available within 24 hours. Christopher, who's asked the question, is also asking if there is a way to contact either of you outside of this. That's entirely up to you, gents, whether it's a LinkedIn job or whether you're happy to receive separate questions from people. I leave that entirely up to you. I don't want to speak for you.
Yep, no problem.
Happy to.
Lovely stuff. Thank you very much indeed. And this, well, we are nearly up to time, actually. But for people who are trying to assess where they are with their situation in being on top of all of the different regulations, if you had one key bit of advice for people, whichever stage of the journey they're at the moment, what would that be?
Well, I'll go first. So, I mean, I think what we've talked about today, there's a lot going on. It's very daunting. It's keeping up with fraudsters, keeping up with regulatory authorities. It's not simple. It's manual, it's labor intensive. And there's a plethora of reasons why you might want to put merchants in your portfolio under more rigorous review processes. Even if it's only a temporary measure. It can be simple things like you received an address or banking change request. It can be the marketing methods that a customer is using. It can be tweaks in their website. I could prime off probably 100 reasons why you might want to consider putting merchants into different levels of enhanced due diligence, making sure that you have the procedures and policy in place to act on that you have an understood risk guideline through from not just your risk underwriting and initial merchant onboarding decisions, but all the way through to your risk and fraud monitoring teams as well. It's critical that everyone's working in lockstep and understands what your policy is and that you're able to pivot because it's always changing. Scott?
I would completely agree. And if you have trouble doing that or any part of that, seek help from experts such as NMI, law firms. ETA has offers that we have, as Joe mentioned, we have our guidelines. Seek all the resources that you can to get yourself comfortable, because the money you spend up front and the peace of mind that you will gain from that are far better than the fines, penalties, and risks that you face down the road.
100%.
Because just picking up on what you were saying there, Darryl, about not being afraid to ask some of those more difficult questions. Mm-hmm. Some people might be thinking, well, we've worked with these people for a long time. Is it going to affect relationships if we ask these questions? Do you have any advice there? Because some people might rely on a more old school business to business relationship and feel maybe difficult about asking those questions sometimes.
When I was new and learning about this, my thought was always, well, you don't want to go to the merchants. You don't want to ask questions of them. Maybe let them know that you're looking at them or something else. But really, that's the best place that you're going to get answers in some case. I mean, you need to talk to them. You need to understand their business. Sure, you can crawl their website for high risk content. Sure, you can do all these other measures. But if you do not understand that business, and Scott even mentioned site inspections earlier, like if we need to go back and there's potential risk, an old school brick and mortar site inspection might be what we need to do for a brick and mortar business sometimes.
Yeah, failure to follow up, failure to ask those questions will lead you into trouble with the regulators. That's one of the steps that they're actually looking for processors to take. Does it create an adversarial relationship with your merchant? No, for two reasons. One, if they are legit, it should be maybe a pain, but they should be able to answer those questions. And if they are intent on becoming fraudsters, then you may have just saved yourself and consumers a lot of pain.
I'll just add as well, make sure that you have documentation of this due diligence. It's one thing to tell a regulator, yeah, I talked to this merchant, I did X, Y, Z, but if you can't prove it, then you probably didn't do it in the first place, or it's going to be looked at that way.
Is that something either of you have seen in the past where people have not documented things and it's bitten them afterwards?
Yes. Or worse, someone said, oh, we don't need to worry about that. The processor, so we don't need to worry about that. And the regulator says, actually, you should have. Right. So
yeah, it's easy to look at your especially the bigger merchants in your portfolio, the one that you consider your gold standard merchants processing high volumes. You don't want to rock a boat, but it's probably better to be rocking the boat and asking questions before it's too late. You're being faced with these fines.
You can always do it in a good professional way. Well, gentlemen, that is all the time we have for today. So thank you very much indeed, Scott. Thank you very much indeed, Darryl. We've covered off a huge amount there. Hopefully it's been useful. The recording of this webinar, as I say, will be available shortly, so you can come back and watch that again and share it with anyone you think might find this useful. Thanks again to our speakers, to you for all of your questions as well. Bye for now.